"Mama, do you ever get tired?" Wren Calloway had been standing at the bathroom mirror, pressing a cool cloth to the back of her neck, when her daughter asked it. Sophie was 4 years old, sitting on the edge of the tub in her pajamas, watching her mother with eyes that were far too observant for someone her age. The question landed softly, the way only a child's honest words can, without weight, without accusation, but carrying both somehow. Wren looked at her daughter's reflection. She managed a smile that she meant even if it cost her something. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "but then I look at you and the tired goes somewhere else for a while." Sophie seemed to find this acceptable. She slid off the tub, patted across the tile, and pressed her small face against her mother's arm for exactly 3 seconds, the length of a 4-year-old's hug when they're already thinking about the next thing. Then she was gone, back down the hallway, and Wren stood alone in the quiet bathroom and allowed herself, for just that moment, to feel everything she spent the rest of her hours carefully not feeling. Her back ached with the particular persistence of someone who had been on their feet for 11 hours. There was a low, pressing throb behind her left eye that had been building since Tuesday. She had eaten half a granola bar at 2 in the afternoon and called it lunch. And now it was nearly 9 at night and she had to be back at Harlow Medical Center by 6 the next morning. She looked at the woman in the mirror for a long, quiet moment, the shadows under her eyes, the slight tension around her mouth that never fully released anymore, and made a silent, private accounting of what she had left. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It always had been enough, and she intended to keep it that way. She was 27 years old. She had been a staff nurse for 3 years. She had been a single mother for 4. Her husband, she had stopped using that word internally a long time ago, replacing it simply with he, had left 9 weeks after Sophie was born. Not dramatically, not with shouting. He had simply packed a bag one morning while Wren was feeding the baby, said he wasn't built for this, and walked out the front door. The absence he left was not the kind that fades. It was the kind that restructures everything, every budget, every schedule, every plan, and forces you to rebuild from the bottom with whatever you have left. There had been a period, in those first months, when Wren had woken at 3 in the morning, not from Sophie's crying, but from her own. Quiet. Controlled, the kind of grief you allow yourself only in the dark when no one needs anything from you. She had moved through that period the same way she moved through difficult shifts. 1 hour at a time, one task at a time, refusing to measure the distance remaining. What Wren had left was considerable, even if she couldn't always see it. She had her parents, Dottie and Frank Calloway, who lived 20 minutes away and took Sophie on Wren's long shifts without ever making her feel like a burden. Frank was a retired school teacher who read Sophie picture books with the full dramatic commitment of a man who believed every story deserved to be told properly. Dottie kept a garden and made soup on Sundays and had a way of pressing a warm mug into Wren's hands without saying anything that communicated everything. They were the kind of parents who understood that the most useful thing they could do was simply show up consistently without being asked. Wren did not take this for granted. She had seen enough of the world to know how rare it was. She had her training, her license, her ability to walk into a room full of fear and be the steadiest thing in it. And she had a quality that couldn't be taught in any program. The genuine inability to look at a suffering person and feel anything other than the immediate need to help. She did not think of this as exceptional. It was simply who she was. The night that changed everything began the way most significant nights do, quietly, without announcement, looking exactly like every other shift. It was a Wednesday. Wren arrived at Harlow Medical at 5:50 in the morning, signed in and took her assignment from the charge nurse, a brisk woman named Paulette who had been running this floor for 16 years and communicated primarily in efficient half-sentences. Wren's section included 6 patients, standard post-procedure care, 1 monitoring case, and a new admission that had come through the previous evening. She reviewed the chart for the new admission in the hallway before entering. Male, 33 years old, listed as a patient presenting with severe exhaustion, elevated blood pressure, and dehydration following what appeared to be weeks of inadequate sleep and poor nutrition. He had arrived without anyone accompanying him, given his name as Grant to the intake staff, and requested, in the notes, minimal interaction. Wren tucked the chart under her arm and went in. The room was dim, the blinds partially closed against the early morning light. The man in the bed had the look of someone who had been formidable recently and was surprised to find himself horizontal. He was lean, with the particular stillness of a person accustomed to being in control of rooms, now temporarily stripped of that ability by his own body's refusal to cooperate. His eyes were open when she entered, watching her without expression. "Good morning," she said, her voice low and unhurried. "I'm Wren. I'll be your nurse today." He nodded once. Said nothing. She moved through her initial checks with quiet efficiency. Blood pressure, temperature, fluid levels, the monitor readings, noting each with small, careful movements that didn't disturb the fragile quiet of the room. She refilled his water without being asked. She adjusted the angle of the bed 2 degrees when she noticed him shift against the pillow. "How are you feeling compared to last night?" she asked. "The same," he said. His voice was measured, guarded in the way that people are when they're not accustomed to being cared for. "That's honest," she said. "I'll take honest over fine." Something in his face shifted. Not much, not visibly to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But Wren had spent 3 years learning to read the small movements of people in pain, and she filed it away without comment. She went about her work. What she didn't allow herself to show, what she had been carefully managing since the previous afternoon, was that she was unwell herself. The headache had graduated from a throb to a steady, insistent pressure behind her eyes. Her temperature, which she had checked discreetly in the staff bathroom that morning, was slightly elevated. Nothing alarming, not yet, but enough that a more self-attentive person would have called in and gone back to bed. Wren had thought about it for approximately 30 seconds before tying her hair back and driving to work. There were 6 patients who needed her. Paulette was already short-staffed, and if she went home, someone else would carry her load, someone already carrying their own. She stayed. Over the course of that Wednesday, she returned to room 14, the man who had given only the name Grant, 4 times outside of her required checks. Once because his IV line had shifted and she wanted to catch it before it became a problem. Once because she noticed his tray had gone untouched and she brought him something simpler, something easier, and set it beside him without comment. Once because the afternoon light had moved and was hitting the monitor screen at an angle that would make reading it uncomfortable for the next few hours. So she adjusted the blind with quiet practicality. The 4th time, she came simply because something in her instinct said to. He was awake, sitting with his hands folded, staring at the ceiling in the way people do when they're thinking about something heavy. She didn't interrupt it. She checked the monitor, noted his readings, began to move toward the door. "You've been on since 6, he said. She paused. "Yes." "It's almost 4. "That's how shifts work," she said with a tone that was not dismissive, just calm. "A beat." "You're not well," he said. It was not a question. She looked at him steadily. "I'm functional." "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed quietly. "But it's enough for today." She left before he could say anything else. In the hallway, she stopped for a moment, one hand against the wall, and breathed through the pressure behind her eyes until it settled back to manageable. A passing orderly gave her a look. She straightened, gave him a small nod, and continued to her next room. She did not know that the man in room 14 had watched her go and sat with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something uncomfortable and clarifying. Like a window being opened in a room that had been closed too long. He had spent years evaluating institutions, systems, performance. He had read hundreds of reports on patient care quality and staff efficiency and all the measurable things that hospitals track because they are easier to track than the unmeasurable ones. He had never, in all those years, sat in a bed in one of his own facilities and simply watched. The experience was doing something to his understanding that he hadn't expected, and the woman in the blue scrubs who pressed her hand to the wall and breathed and kept going was at the center of it. His name was not simply Grant. His full name was Grant Elias Harmon. He was 33 years old. He was the chief executive officer of Harlow Medical Center. He had built that position over 8 years of deliberate, exhausting, sometimes ruthless professional work, starting as a hospital administrator at 24, navigating boardrooms and budget crises and the particular kind of institutional politics that wears people to the edge. He had turned 2 underperforming facilities around before taking the top position at Harlow 3 years ago. Under his leadership, the hospital's operational metrics had improved significantly. He was respected and, in certain circles, quietly feared. He was also, as his body had finally and firmly communicated, running on empty. His personal physician had told him 3 weeks ago, with the measured seriousness of someone who has said a thing twice already, that if he did not rest, his body would make the decision for him. Grant had acknowledged this, thanked her, and continued working. Then last Tuesday, his blood pressure had spiked during a board call, and he had found himself briefly unable to see clearly, and something in him had finally listened. He had admitted himself under a simplified name because he did not want the institutional machinery of his own hospital to engage on his behalf. He did not want upgraded rooms or hushed deferential care. He wanted to rest, and he wanted, though he could not have articulated this clearly, to understand something about what this place actually was when the lights came on and the people who ran it weren't watching. What he found in room 14 was Wren Calloway. He watched her the way he had always watched people, analytically, quietly, looking for what was real versus what was performed. In 16 years of hospital work, he had developed a sharp eye for the difference between people who were doing their job and people who were present in it. The gap between those two things was wider than most people understood, and harder to find than any metric he had ever measured. Wren was the second kind. Entirely, genuinely, the second kind. He watched her come in and adjust the blind without being asked. He watched her notice the untouched tray and solve the problem without drawing attention to it. He watched her speak to the older woman in the room. Across the hall, he could see it from his doorway when the door was open, with a patience and warmth that didn't diminish across the 10th hour of a shift the way most people's did. He watched her stop at the doorway of a room 2 doors down and speak briefly to a young man whose family hadn't visited yet, not as part of any formal check, just because she had noticed his light was still on at 11 the previous night and had remembered small things, invisible things unless you were paying attention. Grant was paying attention, and he watched her press one hand against the wall in the hallway and breathe when she thought no one was looking, then straighten and continue. That image stayed with him longer than any of the others. Wren finished her shift at 6:15, stayed 20 minutes past to complete her notes, and drove home in the particular silence of someone too tired for the radio. Her mother had Sophie fed and bathed, and when Wren walked in the door, Sophie ran to her with the full-body commitment of a child who has been waiting. Wren crouched down and held her for a long moment, her eyes closed. "Tired?" Sophie asked against her shoulder. "A little," Wren said. "Did you help people?" "I tried to." Sophie leaned back and looked at her mother with those serious, luminous eyes. "Then it was a good day," she said, with the certainty of someone delivering established fact. Wren laughed, a real one, brief and warm, and hugged her again. Her mother, Dottie, watched from the kitchen doorway with an expression she kept to herself. She had been watching her daughter come home like this for 3 years. The careful walk, the way she held herself together until the door closed behind her, the way she lit up the moment Sophie reached her. Dottie had her own feelings about all of it. The weight her daughter carried and never complained about, the smallness of their apartment and the size of Wren's heart. She kept most of those feelings folded away because Wren didn't need to manage anyone else's emotions on top of her own. What she did every Sunday was make a pot of soup, and every Sunday Wren ate 2 bowls without being asked. And that was its own kind of conversation. 2 days later, on a Friday morning, Ren received a message through the hospital's internal system asking her to come to the administrative offices at the end of her shift. The message came from HR. It offered no further detail. She spent the better part of the day turning it over quietly. The way you do when you're too practiced at self-control to panic, but too honest to pretend you're not concerned. She reviewed her recent shifts in her mind. She could not identify anything she had done wrong, but the absence of wrongdoing has never reliably protected anyone from a summons to administration, and she knew it. Paulette passed her in the hallway mid-morning and gave her a look that communicated nothing useful. At 4:30, still in her scrubs, Ren walked down the corridor toward the administrative wing, a part of the hospital she rarely visited, with carpeted floors and the particular quiet of rooms where decisions were made. A receptionist she didn't recognize directed her to a conference room. She pushed open the door. Grant Harmon was standing at the window. He was in different clothes, a well-cut shirt, no longer a patient gown, and he was entirely, unmistakably, not the man who had been lying in room 14 asking for minimal interaction. He held himself differently in this room, with the quiet authority of someone entirely at home in it. Ren stopped inside the doorway. She looked at him. She looked at the HR director seated at the table and the woman beside her whom she didn't recognize. She looked back at him. Something in her chest went very still. "Please sit down," he said. His voice was the same, measured, careful. "I owe you an explanation before anything else." She sat. She kept her face composed with the same discipline she used in difficult rooms on the floor. He told her simply and directly. His name, his position, the reason he had admitted himself the way he had, what he had observed over the course of the day he spent in her care and the day after, before his discharge. The room was quiet when he finished. Ren looked at him for a long moment. "You were watching," she said. It was not an accusation, just a recognition. "I was," he said. "I want to be honest about that. Why are you telling me now?" He paused, genuinely, not for effect. "Because I'm going to make some changes to how this department is staffed and supported, and I needed you to understand why. And because," he stopped, seemed to choose his next words with more care than the previous ones. "Because you were unwell that day. I could see it. And you stayed. And you gave every patient on your floor the same quality of care you would have given them at full strength. And I think you do that every time. And I don't think anyone has ever told you that they noticed." The HR director was looking at a folder. The other woman was looking at her hands. Ren looked at Grant Harmon and felt something she hadn't felt in a professional context in longer than she could accurately recall. The sensation of being genuinely, accurately seen. She did not cry. She was not built for crying in conference rooms, but her voice, when she spoke, was slightly less even than usual. "I wasn't doing anything extraordinary," she said. "I was doing my job." "I know," he said. "That's what made it extraordinary." A silence settled in the room, not uncomfortable, but full. Outside, the hospital continued its rhythm. Footsteps in corridors, a PA announcement 3 floors up, the distant sound of an elevator opening. The ordinary machinery of a place built around human need. Ren sat inside that silence and let the words land properly. The way you let something rest before deciding what to do with it. Then she looked at him steadily and said the thing that had been sitting quietly in her chest since he began speaking. "The patients on that floor? They deserve this. Not just me. All of the nurses who come in short-staffed and stay late and eat at their desks. If what you saw in room 14 tells you something needs to change, please make sure it changes for all of them." Grant Harmon looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully name. Then he nodded, once slowly, like a man receiving instruction rather than giving it. "That," he said quietly, "was already the plan. The changes came gradually. The way real changes do, better staffing ratios on Ren's floor, not announced with fanfare. Simply implemented, appearing in the schedule 1 rotation at a time. A formal review of the nurse support program that resulted in expanded mental health resources and a proper meal break policy that Paulette enforced with the same energy she brought to everything. 3 months later, a new protocol for flagging nurses who were showing signs of illness during shifts, designed to get them relief without penalty. A policy that, the memo noted, had been developed in consultation with floor staff. Wren was one of the staff members consulted. She was promoted to senior nurse 8 months after that Friday meeting. The promotion came through the normal process, reviewed by a committee based on her record. Grant Harmon had not interfered with it. He had, Wren later understood, simply ensured that the normal process actually looked at the people it was supposed to be looking at. She ran into him occasionally, in hallways, at a staff meeting she was asked to contribute to, once in the cafeteria where they both reached for coffee at the same moment and acknowledged each other with the quiet ease of people who have an understanding that doesn't require constant tending. He asked about Sophie once carefully, having heard Wren mention her in the staff meeting. Wren answered simply. He listened without the awkward performance of interest, just listened, the way people do when they actually want to know. Their relationship was professional. Warm, honest, grounded in mutual respect. Nothing more and nothing less. Some connections don't need to be more than what they are to be meaningful. On a Tuesday evening in October, almost exactly a year after that Wednesday shift, Wren was walking through the hospital lobby at the end of her day when she heard her name. She turned. It was Frank, her father, standing near the entrance with Sophie beside him. They had come, apparently, to pick her up, something they did occasionally when Dottie had the car and the evening was mild enough to walk. Sophie was wearing her yellow raincoat, though it hadn't rained, and was holding a drawing she had made at her grandparents' house. A figure in blue scrubs, surrounded by smaller figures. With the word Mama printed carefully at the top, Wren crouched down to take it. "That's you," Sophie said, pointing. "And those are the people you help." Wren studied the drawing. The blue figure was in the center. Around it were 7 or 8 smaller shapes, each with a smile that Sophie had drawn with a single careful curved line. "It's perfect," Wren said. Sophie nodded. Completely satisfied, Frank put his hand briefly on Wren's shoulder, his particular language for "I'm proud of you," and they walked together toward the lobby doors. Wren carried the drawing carefully, the way you carry something you already know you'll keep. She thought about the bathroom mirror a year ago and the accounting she had made of what she had left. She thought about Sophie pressing 3 seconds of warmth against her arm and disappearing down the hallway. She thought about a hand against a wall, a breath held and then released, and the quiet decision to keep going that she had made so many times. It had become simply the way she moved through the world. She did not feel that she had arrived anywhere exceptional. She felt, if she was honest, mostly the same. Still tired at the end of long days. Still stretching every dollar. Still waking some mornings with the familiar weight of everything resting on her before she was fully awake. But something had shifted in the quality of it. The weight was the same. She was, perhaps, a little steadier beneath it. Grant Harmon passed them in the entrance, heading back in from an outside meeting. He saw Wren and her family without intruding on the moment. Just took it in with the quiet, observational stillness that was simply how he moved through the world. He looked at the woman who had pressed her hand against a wall and breathed, and then kept going. He looked at the child in the yellow raincoat. He looked at the drawing. He continued, inside without saying anything, but he carried it with him, the image of it, for a long time. After, she had ignored her own pain for years before. Anyone outside her family noticed. She had not done it for recognition. She had done it because the person in front of her needed her, and that had always been enough reason. But here is what kindness does, quietly, over time. It builds a record. It accumulates. It becomes a thing that even the most guarded people cannot look away from. Forever. The world is full of positions and titles and rooms where decisions are made. But the truest greatness lives in hallways, in the person who adjusts, the blind before you ask, Who brings you something simpler when you can't manage the tray? Who presses one hand against a wall and breathes and then keeps going? Keep going. Someone is watching. And more importantly, the people who need you are waiting. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Let's spread more stories of kindness and hope together.